I'm going to take you deep into time, into the distant history of Japan. But this isn't just a story. This is a discovery. The real story of the samurai, those legendary warriors. Before we begin this journey through time, if you enjoy these deep dives into history's most fascinating stories, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us create more content like this, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Your support means everything. Imagine. Thousands of years ago, where white blossoms danced in the wind, where clouds crowned mountain peaks, where ancient temples stood silent in misty valleys. Japan. An island nation isolated from the world, developing its own unique culture, its own path through history. And at the center of that path for nearly 1,000 years, stood the samurai. But who were they really? Close your eyes and let the images form. Perhaps you see a warrior in gleaming armor, sword raised high, honor burning in his eyes. Perhaps you see midnight duels, codes of loyalty unto death, fearless fighters who chose death over dishonor. This is the legend. This is what centuries of stories, movies, and myths have given us. But tonight, as you drift towards sleep, I'll share with you the real story. A story more complex, more human, and in many ways, more fascinating than any legend. Because the samurai were not just warriors. For most of their history, they weren't warriors at all. They were bureaucrats, tax collectors, administrators living off rice stipends in a time of peace that lasted 2.5 centuries. The code of bushidō, that sacred warrior ethic we hear so much about? It was largely invented after the samurai were already gone, created in the late 1800s to serve nationalist purposes. The reality was far messier, far more interesting, and far more human than the polished myth. So breathe deeply. Let your body relax. Feel the tension leaving your muscles, your jaw, your forehead. Tonight, we travel together through nearly 1,000 years of history. From the elegant courts of ancient Heian, through centuries of warfare and chaos, through a long peace that transformed warriors into clerks, and finally to the moment when the samurai class was abolished entirely, disappearing into history and myth. This is a long journey. There's no rush. Let the story wash over you. If you drift away into sleep, that's exactly what should happen. This tale will be here, unfolding in the quiet darkness, whether you're listening or dreaming. The samurai's story spans centuries, and we have all night to explore it. So let us begin at the very beginning, in an age of poetry and elegance, when the samurai didn't yet exist, but the forces that would create them were already gathering like storm clouds on a summer horizon. Our journey begins in the year 794, in a city that would become one of the most refined capitals the world has ever known. Heian, the capital of peace and tranquility. Today we know it as Kyoto. Breathe in the incense-scented air of that ancient court. Picture wooden palaces with sweeping curved roofs, gardens designed with mathematical precision, artificial lakes reflecting the moon like mirrors. The Heian period was an age of extraordinary cultural sophistication. At the imperial court, nobles composed poetry in Chinese characters, practiced calligraphy as high art, and devoted themselves to aesthetic refinement. The women of the court, particularly, created a golden age of literature. Lady Murasaki Shikibu wrote the tale of Genji, often considered the world's first novel, a 1,000-page exploration of court life, love, and loss written around the year 1008. Her contemporary Seishanagon kept the Pillow Book, a collection of observations, lists, and reflections that still feels startlingly modern today. These nobles lived in a world of exquisite sensitivity. The wrong color combination in one's layered robes could be a social disaster. The ability to compose a poem in response to a cherry blossom or a melancholy rain was essential to advancement. Men and women conducted love affairs through elaborate exchanges of poetry written on carefully selected paper, attached to seasonally appropriate flowers. The court had over 400 ceremonial occasions throughout the year, each with specific protocols, costumes, and meanings. But breathe deeply and look beyond the palace walls. The Heian court was beautiful, refined, and increasingly irrelevant. The emperors and their courtiers lived in a bubble of ceremony and art, disconnected from the reality of governing their nation. The provinces, the countryside beyond the capital, were becoming another world entirely. Japan in the Heian period was, in theory, governed by a centralized state modeled on Chinese principles. The land belonged to the emperor, and was redistributed periodically to farmers who paid taxes directly to the central government. In practice, this system was collapsing. Powerful families, including branches of the imperial family itself, began accumulating private estates called shōn. These estates were tax-exempt, removing more and more land from government control. Imagine you're a local governor, appointed by the court in Heian. You've traveled for weeks from the capital to reach your province. The journey took you through mountains and across rivers, far from the refined world of poetry and incense. Here you face practical problems. Disputes over land, bandits on the roads, rebellious local strongmen, peasants who don't want to pay taxes. And the court expects you to handle all of this while maintaining the elegant manners of a Heian noble. It's impossible. And so, gradually the governors began to adapt. They hired local warriors, men with military skills, to enforce order. These warriors came from various backgrounds. Some were minor nobles who had left the capital and settled in the provinces. Some were descended from princes who had been given surnames and removed from the imperial line to save expenses. The most important of these surnames were Minamoto and Taira, both branches of the imperial family tree. These provincial warriors were not yet samurai. That word wouldn't become common for centuries. They were called bushi, or sometimes mono no fu, both meaning simply fighting men. They wore simpler armor than the elaborate gear we imagine today, often just leather and iron plates laced together. They trained obsessively with the bow, which was the primary weapon of Japanese warfare. Swordsmanship existed, but it was secondary. A warrior's worth was measured by his skill as a mounted archer. Picture the life of such a warrior in the year 1000. He lives on a small estate, perhaps inherited from his father, perhaps granted in return for military service. He rises before dawn to practice archery. He trains his sons in the same skills. He may spend months or years without any actual fighting, but he must be ready. His household includes not just his immediate family, but also retainers, servants, and perhaps a few other fighting men bound to him by oaths of loyalty. These bonds of loyalty were personal, direct, face-to-face. A warrior pledged himself to a more powerful lord who provided land, protection, and support. In return, the warrior offered military service. There was no abstract loyalty to a state or nation. The loyalty was to a person, a lord who you knew, who had proven worthy of your service. This would become the foundation of samurai culture, but in the Heian period, it was still informal, still developing. Now let your mind drift forward through the decades of the late Heian period. Feel the passage of time like water flowing. The Minamoto and Taira clans are growing in power and prominence. They're being called to the capital more and more often to settle disputes that the court nobles can no longer handle themselves. In the year 935, a rebellion breaks out in eastern Japan. Taira no Masakado, a warrior of formidable skill and ambition, declares himself the new emperor and attempts to create a separate kingdom in the east. The court is horrified but also helpless. They must call on other warriors to suppress the rebellion. The fighting lasts for years and is brutal, but eventually Masakado is killed, his head sent to the capital as proof. This set a pattern. Warriors fighting warriors. The court nobles were spectators, sometimes sponsors, but never participants. They hired the Minamoto or Taira clans to fight their battles, and slowly, inevitably, the warriors gained more power than those who hired them. The Taira clan became particularly prominent at court. Taira no Kayamori, born in the year 1118, rose through a combination of military skill and political cunning. He married his daughter to the emperor, making his grandson an imperial heir. He was appointed to the highest governmental positions. By the 1160s, the Taira clan controlled the government in all but name, while the emperor remained a ceremonial figurehead. But feel the tension building. The Minamoto clan, equally proud, equally descended from emperors, had been pushed aside. Their leader, Minamoto no Yoshitomo, had supported the wrong side in a court dispute. He was killed and his clan scattered. His infant sons were supposed to be executed, but were spared through various acts of mercy and placed in temples or sent into exile. This mercy would prove to be Taira Kayamori's fatal mistake. Breathe deeply. Feel the gathering storm. The year is 1180. Japan is about to explode into a civil war that will transform it forever. The Genpei War, named for the alternative readings of the characters in Minamoto, Gen, and Taira Hei, would last 5 years and decide the fate of the nation. One of those infant boys who had been spared, Minamoto no Yoritamo, had grown to manhood in exile. He had never forgotten his family's humiliation. In 1180, with backing from powerful families who resented Taira dominance, he raised his banner in rebellion. Across Japan, warriors chose sides. The pattern of loyalty was complex, not simply Minamoto versus Taira, but a web of local alliances, old grudges, and calculated decisions about which side would win. Picture the battles. Not the disciplined warfare of later centuries, but chaotic clashes of mounted archers. Warriors would ride forward, announce their names and lineage in formal challenges, then loose arrows at each other. The bow was paramount. A skilled archer could shoot arrow after arrow with devastating accuracy from horseback at full gallop. The battles were often small, sometimes just a few dozen warriors on each side, occasionally growing to thousands when major armies met. The war raged across Japan. In 1184, the Taira suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of Owazu. Taira Kayamori had died of illness in 1181, his last words reportedly a wish to see Yoritomo's head placed on his grave. Now his heirs were losing ground steadily. The Minamoto had produced two military geniuses, Yoritomo himself, a brilliant politician and organizer, and his younger brother Yoshitsune, perhaps the greatest warrior of the age. Yoshitsune's campaigns became legendary even in his own lifetime. In 1184 he led a surprise attack down impossibly steep cliffs at the Battle of Ichi-no-Tani, falling on the Taira camp from a direction they considered impassable. Horses and warriors plunged down the mountainside, crashing into the enemy at dawn. The Taira fled to their ships. Feel the momentum shifting. The Taira were being pushed westward toward the sea. They were powerful on water, controlling much of the maritime trade and having alliances with pirates and sea clans. But Yoshitsune adapted. He learned naval warfare, gathered ships, and pursued them relentlessly. The end came at Dan-no-Yura in 1185. Picture a narrow strait between Japan's main islands, the waters churning with fierce currents. On these waters the final battle unfolded. Hundreds of ships on both sides, warriors shooting arrows from deck to deck. The battle lasted for hours. The currents shifted, favoring first one side then the other. But gradually the Minamoto gained the upper hand. As defeat became certain, the Taira chose death over capture. The Dowager Empress, Taira no Kayamori's widow, took her grandson, the child Emperor Antoku, in her arms. He was only 7 years old. She told him they were going to a better place, a palace beneath the waves. Then she jumped into the sea, drowning them both. One by one the Taira nobles followed, leaping from their ships with their treasures and their honor. The sacred imperial regalia, the sword and jewel, sank into the strait and were lost. The sword was never recovered, a loss that resonated for centuries. The Genpei War was over. The Taira were destroyed. And Minamoto no Yoritomo stood supreme, the most powerful man in Japan. But what he did next would change everything. Before we move forward, rest for a moment in this transitional time. Feel the exhaustion of war, the relief of peace, however uncertain. The Genpei War had been devastating, but it had also clarified something. Warriors, not court nobles, now held real power in Japan. During these decades of conflict, a distinct warrior culture had been developing. The bonds between lord and retainer became more formalized. Warriors began articulating a set of values: loyalty above all, martial skill as virtue, honor and death. These weren't written down as a code, not yet. They were practical attitudes developed by men whose lives depended on trust and courage. The aesthetics of war developed too. Armor became more elaborate, decorated with clan symbols and bold colors. The war stories that spread through Japan celebrated individual heroism, clever strategies, tragic sacrifices. The tale of the Haika, an epic account of the Genpei War, would be chanted by blind monks for centuries, ensuring that these warrior values entered Japanese cultural consciousness permanently. But remember, even now these warriors were not yet the samurai of legend. They were practical men, often crude, frequently brutal, always focused on survival and advantage. The elaborate ethical codes, the devotion to ceremony, the aestheticized violence, all of that would come later, much later. For now, they were simply the victors, standing amid the ruins of the old order, about to build something new. Yoritomo's younger brother Yoshitsune, the brilliant general, should have been celebrated. Instead, Yoritomo grew jealous and suspicious of his brother's popularity and military genius. He turned against Yoshitsune, hunting him relentlessly. Yoshitsune fled, wandered, and finally committed suicide in 1189 to avoid capture, performing the ritual of seppuku, cutting his own abdomen open. He was 30 years old. This tragedy became another foundational legend of warrior culture. The loyal brother betrayed, the military genius destroyed by politics, choosing honorable death over shameful surrender. The story would be told and retold, in plays, in stories, in songs for centuries. Even today, Yoshitsune remains a tragic hero in Japanese culture. But Yoritomo had eliminated a threat. Now he could build his new government without rivals. Breathe deeply. Feel the shift in the wind. Something unprecedented is about to happen. Minamoto no Yoritomo could have done what powerful warriors had done before. Insinuate himself into the court, marry his daughters to emperors, rule from behind the throne like Taira Kayamori. Instead he chose a different path. He would create a completely separate government, a military government, running parallel to the emperor's court but holding real power. He established his headquarters not in Kyoto, the ancient capital, but in Kamakura, a small town in eastern Japan surrounded by mountains on 3 sides and the sea on the 4th. It was a fortress location easily defensible. More importantly, it was far from the effete atmosphere of the imperial court. Yoritomo wanted his government to remain militaristic, practical, and uncorrupted by courtly refinement. In 1192 Yoritomo received the title of shogun. This word, which would become so famous, originally just meant general. But Yoritomo transformed it into something more, the head of a military government, deriving authority not from the emperor directly, but from his control of warriors throughout Japan. The emperor remained in Kyoto, conducting ceremonies, providing legitimacy through his divine descent, but politically neutered. Real power resided in Kamakura. Picture Yoritomo in his simple headquarters, so different from the elaborate palaces of Kyoto. He wore warrior clothing, not court robes. He met with his retainers directly, personally, hearing their concerns and issuing orders. He established a system of land stewards and military governors throughout the provinces, creating a network of warriors loyal to him personally. These were not salaried bureaucrats, but men who held their positions in exchange for military service, men who could be called upon to fight when needed. The system had elegant simplicity. Warriors held land. They governed that land, collected its taxes, maintained order. In return they owed military service to Yoritomo. The bonds were direct, personal, and backed by both sides' self-interest. A lord who didn't protect his retainers would find himself without support. A retainer who betrayed his lord would be destroyed by the others, his lands confiscated and given to someone more loyal. But Yoritomo's triumph was brief. In 1199 he fell from his horse and died. He was 52 years old. The cause of death remains mysterious. Some sources suggest he died from illness following the fall. Others whisper about assassination. Whatever the truth, his death created a crisis. His sons were young, weak, and easily manipulated. Now comes one of the most remarkable political arrangements in history. Breathe in the complexity, the layers of shadow power. Yoritomo's widow, Hojo Masako, came from a powerful warrior family. She was intelligent, ruthless, and determined that her family would maintain power. But there was a problem. Women could not formally hold political office, and the shogunate required a male leader from the Minamoto line. The solution was ingenious. Yoritomo's sons would be shoguns in name, but real power would be held by the Hojo family, serving as regents to the shogun. So now you had the emperor in Kyoto, a figurehead with divine status but no power. The shogun in Kamakura, theoretically the military ruler, but actually controlled by the Hojo regent. And the Hojo themselves holding real power without formal title. This system, which sounds impossibly unstable, endured for over a century. The Hojo proved to be remarkably effective administrators. They codified laws, establishing clear procedures for settling disputes over land, the primary source of conflict among warriors. The Gozaibai Shikimoku, promulgated in 1232, was a straightforward legal code emphasizing practical justice over elaborate precedent. It addressed everything from inheritance rights to appropriate punishments for various crimes to the duties of stewards and constables. Under Hojo rule, Japan experienced relative stability. The warrior class continued to develop its culture. Training in martial arts became more formalized. The bow remained primary, but swordsmanship gained importance. Warriors practiced with various weapons, spears, knives, and grappling techniques. The ideal warrior was proficient in all forms of combat, could endure hardship, and possessed unwavering loyalty to his lord. Daily life for a warrior involved managing his estate, training in martial skills, hunting, and preparing for wars that might never come. Many warriors also developed cultural interests. Poetry remained important, as did calligraphy and the tea ceremony, which was becoming increasingly elaborate. The influence of Zen Buddhism, recently arrived from China, began to spread among the warrior class. Zen's emphasis on discipline, meditation, and direct experience appealed to military men. Picture a warrior's compound in the year 1250. Wooden buildings with thatched roofs surrounded by a simple fence. Training grounds where young men practice archery and swordsmanship. A small Buddhist altar where the family pays respects to ancestors. Life is hard by court standards, but there's a sense of purpose, of belonging to something larger than oneself. These men know they are the guardians of order, that their skills and loyalty maintain the peace. But that peace was about to be tested by the greatest threat Japan had ever faced. Breathe deeply. Imagine looking out across the sea toward the west, toward the Asian mainland. Something is moving there, something vast and terrible. An empire that has conquered most of the known world. An army like nothing Japan has ever faced. The Mongols are coming. By the year 1260, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to Vietnam. It was the largest contiguous land empire in history, built on the military genius of Genghis Khan and his successors. Now Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson, ruled China as the emperor of the Yuan dynasty. He had conquered Korea. And he began to look toward Japan. In 1268 and again in 1270, Kublai Khan sent envoys to Japan demanding submission. The letters were arrogant, referring to Japan as a small country that should acknowledge Mongol supremacy. The Hojo regent, Tokimyun, was only 18 years old when the first letter arrived, but he proved to have steel in his spine. He refused. The Mongol envoys were dismissed without concessions. Tokimyun knew war was coming. He ordered coastal defenses prepared, warriors mustered, preparations made. But how do you prepare for an enemy you've never fought, using tactics you've never seen? In November of 1274, the storm broke. 900 Mongol and Korean ships carrying perhaps 23,000 soldiers crossed from Korea and attacked the islands of Tsushima and Iki, between Korea and Japan. The small garrisons were slaughtered. The Mongols were ruthless, killing civilians, burning villages. They brought with them weapons and tactics that terrified the Japanese. Massed formations of infantry, explosive projectiles launched from catapults, disciplined units moving in coordination rather than individual combat. The Japanese warriors fought with the tactics they knew, announcing their names, riding forward individually, engaging in personal combat. Against Mongol discipline, these tactics were worse than useless. Warriors who called out their proud lineages were cut down by volleys of arrows from Mongol composite bows, shorter but more powerful than Japanese bows. Samurai who expected single combat found themselves surrounded by groups of Mongol soldiers working together to pull them from their horses and butcher them. Picture the first encounters. Japanese warriors riding forward confidently, expecting honorable combat. Instead, facing walls of disciplined enemies, hearing the strange explosions of Chinese explosive projectiles, seeing their traditional tactics fail utterly. The horror, the confusion, the slow realization that they were facing something entirely new. The Mongols pushed inland, approaching Hakata Bay near modern Fukuoka. The Japanese fought desperately, slowly adapting, learning to fight in groups, to use the terrain, to avoid the open field battles where Mongol discipline dominated. And then, suddenly the Mongols withdrew. A storm was approaching and their ships were vulnerable. They retreated to their vessels and sailed away, having proven their military superiority but not achieved conquest. Japan had gained 7 years. Tokimyun used them well. He ordered the construction of a massive stone wall along Hakata Bay, over 12 feet high and stretching for miles. Warriors trained in new tactics. Preparations were made. And everyone waited, knowing the Mongols would return. In 1281 they came again. But this time the Mongol force was far larger. Kublai Khan had spent years preparing. 2 separate fleets set sail, one from Korea carrying perhaps 40,000 troops, and another from southern China carrying over 100,000 soldiers, including southern Chinese, Koreans, and Mongols. Together, they may have constituted the largest seaborne invasion force assembled anywhere in the world up to that time. The Korean fleet arrived first in June of 1281. They attacked the same islands as before, meeting fierce resistance. The Japanese were better prepared now, fighting with new tactics, using the stone wall at Hakata Bay to nullify the Mongol advantage in open combat. Small boats would dart out from the shore at night, boarding Mongol vessels, setting fires, killing crews. The Mongols found themselves unable to establish a beachhead against determined opposition. They waited for the southern fleet to arrive, camping on their ships. This was their mistake. For weeks, the Mongol forces sat in their vessels, crowded, suffering from heat and disease. The Japanese harried them constantly with small raids. Morale declined. Supplies dwindled. Then in August, a typhoon struck. Picture the scene. Thousands of ships, many of them poorly constructed with greenwood under pressure from Kublai Khan's demands for speed, caught in a massive storm. The wind screaming, waves like mountains, ships smashing into each other or being driven onto rocks. The sea churning with debris and bodies. The storm lasted for 2 days, and when it cleared, the Mongol fleet was destroyed. Thousands of ships sunk. Tens of thousands of soldiers drowned or left stranded on small islands where they were hunted down by Japanese forces. The few ships that survived limped back to the mainland. Japan had been saved by the storm, which was called the kamikaze, the divine wind, a clear sign that the gods protected Japan from foreign invasion. This belief would have profound consequences centuries later. The Mongol invasions had multiple effects. They proved that Japan's warriors could adapt and survive against the greatest military power of the age. They created a sense of national identity, a feeling that Japan was special, protected by divine favor. The cost was enormous in both money and lives, and the Kamakura shogunate had difficulty rewarding all the warriors who had fought, creating resentment. Kublai Khan planned a third invasion, but abandoned the idea as he grew older and faced problems elsewhere in his vast empire. He died in 1294, never having conquered Japan. Rest now in the quiet that followed the storm. The Mongols never returned, but the invasions had damaged the Kamakura government in subtle ways. The economic strain was severe. Warriors expected rewards for their service, but the Mongols had been defeated, not conquered, so there were no foreign lands to distribute. The shogunate fell into debt. Many warriors became impoverished, their fixed incomes insufficient for rising costs. The Hojo regents became more authoritarian, more distant from the warriors they governed. The elegant simplicity of Yoritomo's system was lost in bureaucratic complexity. Disputes took longer to resolve. Justice seemed less fair. Resentment grew. Emperor Go-Daigo, who ascended to the throne in 1318, was unusual, an emperor who wanted real power, not just ceremonial status. He was intelligent, ambitious, and resentful of the Kamakura shogunate's control. In 1331, his first attempted rebellion was discovered and crushed. He was exiled. But he escaped, raised his banner again, and this time the Kamakura government fell apart. A Kamakura general named Ashikaga Takauji, sent to suppress the emperor's rebellion, switched sides. Other warriors followed. The last Hojo regent committed suicide in 1333, and the Kamakura shogunate that had ruled for nearly a century and a half simply ceased to exist. The system that Yoritomo had built, that had survived the Mongol invasions, collapsed not from external threat but from internal rot and accumulated resentments. Emperor Go-Daigo attempted to restore direct imperial rule, but his dreams were unrealistic. The warriors would not willingly return to powerlessness. Within 3 years, Ashikaga Takauji had turned against the emperor, established a new shogunate in Kyoto, and set up a rival emperor. Japan split into 2 imperial courts, north and south, each claiming legitimacy, each with warrior supporters. The period of unity and relative stability was over. Ahead lay decades of chaos and beyond that, centuries of war. But breathe deeply. Rest. The night is long, and our journey through the samurai's history has only begun. The story becomes darker now, more violent, more complex. Let your body relax completely. Sleep comes, welcome it. The tale continues whether you're awake or dreaming, flowing like the currents of time itself. Picture Japan divided against itself. 2 emperors, each claiming divine authority. 2 courts, each conducting the ancient ceremonies. 2 sets of warrior supporters, fighting for control of a country that no longer had a clear center. This was the Nambakucho, the period of northern and southern courts, a time of constitutional crisis and constant low-level warfare that would last over 50 years. Emperor Go-Daigo, refusing to acknowledge defeat after Ashikaga Takauji's betrayal, fled south to the mountains of Yoshino with the sacred imperial regalia, or at least some of them. The sword had been lost at Dan no Yura, remember, but he held the mirror and jewel. He established his southern court there, claiming to be the legitimate emperor. Meanwhile, Ashikaga Takauji installed a rival emperor in Kyoto from another branch of the imperial family, creating the northern court. Each court issued decrees, appointed officials, and claimed to be Japan's true government. The legitimacy question was genuinely complex. Go-Daigo had the regalia, the sacred objects that symbolized imperial authority. But the northern court controlled Kyoto, the traditional capital, and had the backing of the most powerful warriors. For decades, warriors throughout Japan chose sides based on a mixture of principle, self-interest, local rivalries, and pure opportunism. Some switched sides multiple times as fortunes changed. This was warfare, but not the massive battles of the Genpei War. Instead, imagine local conflicts, raids, skirmishes, betrayals, and shifting alliances. A warrior might hold a small castle for the southern court, then negotiate a better deal with the northern court and switch his allegiance. Villages and estates changed hands repeatedly. The peasants farming the land hardly cared which court claimed them, but they suffered from the constant demands for supplies and the periodic devastation of passing armies. Ashikaga Takauji died in 1358, having established his shogunate but never achieving unchallenged authority. His descendants continued the pattern, shoguns with limited power, ruling through coalition and compromise rather than absolute authority. The southern and northern courts finally reconciled in 1392 after a complicated negotiation involving promises of alternating succession between the two imperial lines, promises that were immediately broken, but at least there was only one emperor again. Yet peace did not follow. The Ashikaga shogunate never achieved the administrative efficiency of the Kamakura government. The shoguns were often weak, sometimes children, frequently manipulated by powerful warrior families. Real power was increasingly local. The great warrior families, the daimyo, ruled their domains like independent kingdoms, paying lip service to the shogun's authority but acting autonomously. But here's something remarkable to consider as you drift toward sleep. Amid all this political chaos, Japanese culture was flourishing in extraordinary ways. The constant warfare hadn't destroyed creativity. In fact, it seemed to stimulate it. The 15th century saw the development of art forms that would define Japanese aesthetics for centuries. The tea ceremony, which had been a relatively simple practice, was transformed into an elaborate ritual by monks and warriors. Imagine sitting in a small tea house, its dimensions precisely calculated, its decorations minimal and carefully chosen. Every movement of the tea master is choreographed, perfected through years of practice. The goal is not just to prepare and drink tea, but to create a moment of perfect tranquility, a space outside ordinary time where host and guests can experience beauty and connection. Even warriors, men of violence, found peace in this ritual. No theater developed during this period, created primarily by Zimi Motokiyo and his father Kanami. No was unlike any theater the world had seen. The actors moved with glacial slowness, their faces hidden behind masks. The plays dealt with ghosts, with obsession, with the inability to let go of the past. The aesthetic was one of profound restraint. A slight tilt of the head could convey overwhelming emotion. The masks, carved by master artisans, seemed to change expression as they caught the light differently. Picture a no performance on a simple wooden stage, torches providing the only light. The principal actor moves with slow, precise steps, chanting in an archaic language that even contemporary audiences found difficult. The chorus sits to the side, narrating and commenting. The musicians play flute and drums, their timing as important as the actor's movements. The whole performance might last hours, but the experience is hypnotic, drawing you into a trance-like state where the boundary between observer and observed dissolves. Zen Buddhism spread widely among the warrior class during the Ashikaga period. Zen's emphasis on direct experience, on breaking through conceptual thinking to sudden enlightenment, appealed to warriors who lived with the constant presence of death. Zen monks advised shoguns and many warriors practiced meditation. Zen aesthetics, particularly the concept of wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection and impermanence, influenced everything from garden design to poetry to daily life. Picture a Zen rock garden like the famous one at Ryoanji Temple in Kyoto, created in this period. 15 rocks placed in a bed of carefully raked white gravel. No plants, no water. Just rocks and gravel. Yet people sit and contemplate it for hours, finding in its austere simplicity something profound about existence itself. What are those rocks? Islands in an ocean? Mountain peaks above clouds? Or simply rocks, complete and perfect in their rockness? Ink painting reached new heights. Artists like Sesshotoyo created landscapes of breathtaking power using just black ink and empty space. A few brush strokes suggested mountains, mist, distance, solitude. The empty space, the ma, was as important as the painted sections. This was art that required the viewer to complete it, to enter into the space and inhabit it imaginatively. While you rest, let me share something that often gets overlooked in samurai history. The economy was changing radically during this period. Japan was shifting from a purely agricultural economy to something more complex, more commercialized, more urban. Markets were spreading throughout the country. Goods that had previously been produced locally were now being traded over long distances. Rice, silk, salt, iron, and countless other commodities moved along trade routes protected and taxed by local daimyo. Guilds of merchants and artisans formed, gaining privileges and monopolies. Money, both imported Chinese coins and domestically produced currency, became more common, replacing the barter system that had previously dominated. Cities grew. Kyoto, despite the chaos, remained a cultural center with perhaps 200,000 people. Other urban centers emerged around powerful temples, important shrines, or daimyo castles. These cities attracted merchants, artisans, entertainers, and monks. Urban culture developed its own character, distinct from both the warrior class and the peasantry. The peasants themselves were changing. The constant warfare required more than just rice farming. Peasants were being mobilized as foot soldiers, called a shigeru. These weren't samurai. They were farmers who fought during warring season and returned to their fields afterward. But their participation in warfare was beginning to break down the strict barriers between warrior and peasant. A capable peasant soldier could sometimes rise in status, gaining land and recognition. The rigid class system of earlier centuries was becoming more fluid. Portuguese traders arrived in Japan in 1543, blown off course by a storm. They brought firearms, arquebus-style muskets that would revolutionize Japanese warfare. Within decades, Japan was producing more firearms than any European nation, and the arquebus became the dominant weapon on battlefields, gradually replacing the bow. But that's getting ahead of our story. For now, in the early Ashikaga period, the groundwork was being laid for all these transformations. Breathe deeply and consider the situation by the mid-1500s. The Ashikaga shogun still sat in Kyoto, still performed ceremonies, still issued decrees. But his actual power extended perhaps a few miles beyond the city walls. Provincial military governors, the shogo who were supposed to represent the shogun's authority, had become independent daimyo, controlling entire provinces as personal fiefs. These daimyo were creating their own administrative systems. They promulgated laws for their territories. They built castles, increasingly sophisticated fortifications made of wood and stone, surrounded by moats and earthworks. Around these castles, castle towns developed where merchants and artisans gathered, protected by the daimyo's power in exchange for taxes and services. Each domain became a mini-state. The daimyo maintained his own warrior band, men sworn to personal loyalty. These retainers in turn had their own followers, creating a pyramid of obligation and service. The system worked as long as everyone believed in it, as long as the benefits of loyalty outweighed the potential gains of betrayal. But that belief was weakening. The late Ashikaga period saw the rise of Gekkakujo, a term meaning the low overcoming the high. This wasn't just military rebellion. It was a social philosophy that ability and strength mattered more than birth and tradition. A talented warrior of humble origins could overthrow his lord and take his place, if he was strong enough, clever enough, ruthless enough. Several great daimyo houses fell this way, replaced by their own subordinates or by completely new families risen from obscurity. This created an atmosphere of constant tension and opportunity. Everyone was watching everyone else, looking for weakness, planning, calculating. Alliances were made and broken with dizzying speed. A daimyo might support the shogun one year, rebel against him the next, then reconcile and declare eternal loyalty the year after that. Trust was a commodity in short supply, and survival required constant vigilance. Picture a daimyo's castle in the year 1460. Wooden walls crowned with defensive galleries. A tall central keep, multiple stories with excellent views of the surrounding countryside. Inside, meetings of the daimyo with his senior retainers, discussing threats and opportunities, planning next season's military campaigns. Spies in every direction, gathering information. Negotiations with potential allies. Displays of force to intimidate rivals. This was the reality of power in late Ashikaga Japan, a reality the shogun in Kyoto could barely influence. And then everything collapsed completely. The Unwind War, beginning in 1467, destroyed whatever remained of the Ashikaga shogunate's authority and plunged Japan into a century of nearly continuous warfare. The cause was almost absurdly trivial, a succession dispute. The shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimasa, had no son, so he designated his younger brother as heir. Then, unexpectedly, his wife gave birth to a son. Two candidates for shogun, each backed by powerful daimyo families pursuing their own interests. The Hosokawa family supported the brother. The Yamana family supported the son. Neither side would back down. In 1467, fighting broke out in Kyoto itself. What began as limited skirmishes escalated into full warfare as more daimyo chose sides. Tens of thousands of warriors converged on the capital. The fighting continued for 10 years, but it wasn't 10 years of constant battle. Rather, it was 10 years of armies camping in and around Kyoto, periodically fighting, burning sections of the city, rebuilding fortifications, waiting, and occasionally engaging in major clashes. Kyoto was devastated. The city that had been Japan's elegant capital for centuries burned repeatedly. Palaces that had stood for hundreds of years were reduced to ash. Temples were looted and destroyed. The population fled. By the time the Unin War officially ended in 1477, Kyoto was a shadow of its former self. Large sections left as burned-out ruins, its population reduced by more than half. But the war's end brought no peace. The daimyo armies dispersed back to their provinces, but the fighting continued locally. The authority of the Ashikaga shogunate was revealed as completely hollow. The shogun had been unable to stop a war fought in his own capital. From this point forward, the shogun was at best a figurehead, at worst irrelevant. Real power belonged to whoever could take it and hold it through force of arms. Japan entered the Sengoku period, the age of warring states. For the next century and more, the country would be torn apart by constant warfare as daimyo fought for survival, expansion, and ultimately unification of the entire realm under their rule. Let the weight of this sink in as you relax deeper. A civilization that had endured for centuries was fragmenting. The old certainties were gone. In their place, opportunity and danger in equal measure, a world where everything was possible and nothing was secure. Open your mind to chaos. Picture a Japan with no center, no unifying authority, just hundreds of daimyo ruling their own domains, each one a potential threat to all the others. This was the Sengoku period, the Warring States era, and it lasted for over a century. It was brutal, creative, terrifying, and transformative. The scale of warfare expanded dramatically. Early samurai conflicts had involved hundreds of warriors, occasionally a few thousand. Sengoku battles involved tens of thousands of soldiers. Armies grew because the nature of warfare changed. The mounted archer, the elite samurai of earlier centuries, was becoming obsolete. Infantry, particularly infantry armed with spears and firearms, dominated the battlefield. The Ishigaru, peasant foot soldiers, became the core of armies. Daimyo recruited thousands of them, trained them in basic tactics, equipped them with long spears called yari, and sent them into battle in massed formations. These weren't individual warriors seeking personal glory. They were units, moving and fighting in coordination. The psychological impact of a wall of spears, hundreds of men advancing in step, was tremendous. And then there were the guns. Remember those Portuguese traders who arrived in 1543? Within a few years, Japanese swordsmiths had figured out how to manufacture firearms. Within a few decades, Japan had more guns than any European country. The arquebus, called Tanegashima in Japanese after the island where the Portuguese first landed, was devastatingly effective. A farmer could be trained to use one in a few weeks. Armor that could stop arrows offered little protection against bullets. The loud report and smoke added to the psychological impact. Picture a Sengoku battle. Morning mist lifting from a valley. Two armies arrayed on opposite hillsides, perhaps 30,000 men total. Banners identifying each unit, drum signals coordinating movements. The battle begins with arquebus fire, hundreds of guns firing in volleys, each rank firing and then kneeling to reload while the rank behind them fires. The noise is overwhelming. Then the armies close and the spear formations clash. Individual samurai still exist, commanding units, fighting when necessary, but the glory days of one-on-one combat are gone. This is mass warfare, industrial in its efficiency and brutality. Castles evolved in response to firearms. Earlier castles had been relatively simple wooden structures on hilltops, designed to defend against arrows and siege tactics that didn't include artillery. Sengoku castles were massive stone and wood fortifications with complex defensive systems. Multiple walls, each higher than the last. Towers at strategic points. Gates designed to force attackers into killing zones. The introduction of stone construction techniques allowed for larger, more permanent fortifications. Some of these castles were enormous. Osaka Castle, Edo Castle, Himeji Castle, structures so large they employed thousands of workers in construction and required years to complete. The castle became the symbol of a daimyo's power, a military necessity and a political statement. The largest castles had accommodations for thousands of warriors and could withstand sieges lasting months or even years. Amid this chaos, three men emerged who would eventually bring Japan under unified control. Their personalities and methods differed dramatically, but together they transformed Japan from a fractured landscape of warring domains into a unified nation. There's a famous Japanese poem about them, describing their different approaches to a nightingale that won't sing. Oda Nobunaga would kill it. Toyotomi Hideyoshi would persuade it. Tokugawa Ieyasu would wait for it to sing. These characterizations, while simplified, contain truth. Oda Nobunaga was born in 1534 into a minor daimyo family in Owari province. As a young man he was considered a fool, dressing inappropriately, acting strangely, showing no respect for tradition. But behind the eccentric behavior was a brilliant military and political mind, utterly ruthless and completely willing to break with tradition if it gave him advantage. Nobunaga embraced firearms enthusiastically when most samurai disdained them as weapons for cowards. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, he deployed 3,000 arquebusiers behind wooden palisades to face the cavalry charge of the Takeda clan, famous for their mounted warriors. The Takeda charged repeatedly, brave and skillful. They were slaughtered. Nobunaga's gunners, firing in rotation to maintain continuous volleys, cut them down. It was a massacre that ended the Takeda's power and proved that traditional samurai tactics were obsolete. Nobunaga was equally ruthless with opponents who resisted. When the Buddhist warrior monks of Mount Hai threatened his power, he surrounded their monastery complex and killed everyone inside, thousands of monks and civilians, burning the ancient temples that had stood for centuries. When the Ikoiki militant Buddhist communities of farmers and low-ranking samurai resisted his rule, he waged a decade-long campaign to crush them, showing no mercy even to those who surrendered. But Nobunaga wasn't just destructive. He encouraged commerce, building markets and reducing tariffs. He welcomed foreigners, particularly Jesuit missionaries who brought interesting knowledge and technology. One missionary, Louis Froys, left detailed accounts of Nobunaga's court. Nobunaga even took a personal liking to an African man brought by the Jesuits, making him a retainer and possibly a samurai, a remarkable act in a society obsessed with bloodlines. By 1582, Nobunaga controlled about a third of Japan and was poised to unify the rest. Then, in a moment of tragic irony, he was betrayed. One of his generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, surrounded Nobunaga in a temple in Kyoto and attacked with overwhelming force. Nobunaga fought back until the situation was hopeless, then committed seppuku. He was 48 years old. His body was never found, probably consumed in the fire that destroyed the temple. And here's where our second unifier enters. Toyotomi Hideyoshi had been Nobunaga's loyal general, risen from humble origins, possibly the son of a peasant. In an age when birth determined everything, Hideyoshi's rise was extraordinary. He was short, reputedly ugly but brilliant in both war and politics. He was called the monkey behind his back, but he had the last laugh. When news of Nobunaga's death reached Hideyoshi, he was campaigning in western Japan. He immediately made peace with his current enemy, force-marched his army back toward Kyoto, and caught Akechi Mitsuhide's forces by surprise. Mitsuhide was defeated and killed within 13 days of Nobunaga's death. Hideyoshi positioned himself as Nobunaga's avenger and legitimate successor. Over the next decade, Hideyoshi completed Nobunaga's work. He defeated or co-opted the remaining independent daimyo through a combination of military force, political skill, and generous offers of alliance. By 1590, he controlled all of Japan, an achievement no one had accomplished since the imperial government's collapse centuries earlier. Hideyoshi couldn't become shogun because he lacked the proper lineage. Instead, he took the ancient court title of Kampuku or imperial regent. The emperor in Kyoto, politically powerless but symbolically essential, granted Hideyoshi the impressive surname Toyotomi. Hideyoshi then implemented sweeping social reforms aimed at freezing Japan's social structure. The most important of these was the Sword Hunt of 1588. Hideyoshi ordered all peasants to surrender their weapons. The stated purpose was to collect metal for a great Buddha statue. The actual purpose was to create a clear distinction between the warrior class, who could carry swords, and peasants who could not. Hideyoshi, who had risen from peasant origins himself, was now pulling up the ladder behind him, ensuring that no one else could do what he had done. He conducted elaborate land surveys, assessing the productivity of every rice field in Japan. This allowed for rational tax assessment but also tied peasants to their land and fixed the income of samurai retainers. He issued edicts forbidding people from changing their occupation or class. Japan was being organized into a rigid hierarchy: samurai at the top, peasants below them, then artisans and merchants, with outcasts beneath all of these. But Hideyoshi's greatest ambition and his greatest failure lay overseas. With Japan unified, he dreamed of conquering China itself. This was hubris of astounding proportion. China was vastly larger and more populous than Japan. But Hideyoshi was convinced of his own genius and his warriors' superiority. In 1592, Hideyoshi launched his invasion. 200,000 Japanese warriors crossed to Korea in over 1,000 ships. It was the largest seaborne invasion in history to that point, surpassing even the Mongol attempts against Japan. The initial assault was devastating. Japanese forces, experienced from decades of warfare and equipped with superior firearms, smashed through Korean resistance and captured Seoul within weeks. Picture the Korean perspective. They had been at peace for 2 centuries under Confucian governance. Their military was unprepared, their weapons outdated. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened Japanese warriors equipped with guns were pouring across their country. Cities fell. The court fled. It seemed that Korea would be conquered entirely. But then the situation turned. The Korean Navy, led by Admiral Lee Sun-sin, one of history's great naval commanders, destroyed Japanese supply lines using turtle ships, ironclad vessels with cannons. China, alarmed at Japan on its doorstep, sent massive armies to Korea's defense. The Japanese advance stalled. The war turned into a grinding conflict with horrific casualties on all sides. The Japanese warriors in Korea found themselves far from home, fighting guerrilla resistance from Korean fighters, facing massive Chinese armies, dealing with disease and starvation as supply lines were cut. The samurai practice of taking heads as proof of enemy kills was applied so enthusiastically that when supplies to ship heads back to Japan became difficult, they took noses instead. Entire barrels of preserved Korean and Chinese noses were sent to Hideyoshi as trophies. A nose mound, Mimizuka, still exists in Kyoto, a grim monument to this atrocity. The war dragged on for 6 years. Negotiations repeatedly failed. Fighting resumed. Then in 1598 Hideyoshi died of illness. He was 61 years old. His final orders were to continue the war, but his generals knew better. They negotiated truces and withdrew the Japanese forces from Korea. The invasion had been a disaster, costing hundreds of thousands of lives, devastating Korea and gaining Japan nothing. Korea would remember this invasion as one of the greatest calamities in their history. Relations between Japan and Korea would remain poisoned for centuries. But in Japan itself, Hideyoshi's death created a new crisis. His heir was a child, and the great daimyo who had submitted to Hideyoshi's overwhelming force began maneuvering for advantage. The third unifier had been waiting for decades. Tokugawa Ieyasu was born in 1542 into a small daimyo family caught between more powerful neighbors. As a child, he had been held hostage by rival clans, learning early that survival required patience and careful judgment. He had served Nobunaga loyally, becoming one of his most important generals. After Nobunaga's death, he had recognized Hideyoshi's superior position and submitted, accepting lands in eastern Japan far from the center of power. Ieyasu was everything Nobunaga and Hideyoshi were not: cautious, patient, willing to wait for exactly the right moment. While Hideyoshi's armies were dying in Korea, Ieyasu was building his power base in eastern Japan, creating alliances, accumulating wealth, and appearing completely loyal to Hideyoshi while planning for the day when Hideyoshi would no longer be there. That day came in 1598. Hideyoshi's son, Hideyori, was only 5 years old. Hideyoshi had appointed a council of 5 great daimyo to rule as regents until Hideyori came of age. But unity immediately collapsed. Factions formed. The most powerful daimyo, men who controlled vast armies and extensive territories, maneuvered for position. By 1600, the situation had crystallized into 2 coalitions. The Eastern Army, led by Tokugawa Ieyasu, controlled the eastern half of Japan and included about 80,000 troops. The Western Army, nominally led by Ishida Mitsunari but including many powerful daimyo pursuing their own interests, controlled western Japan and numbered perhaps 90,000. On October 21, 1600, the 2 armies met at Sekigahara, a valley where several roads converged in central Japan. This would be one of the most decisive battles in Japanese history. Over 150,000 samurai and a shigeru faced each other, armed with spears, swords, and tens of thousands of firearms. The battle began in morning fog. The Western Army held the high ground, a significant advantage. 4 hours the fighting was fierce and the outcome uncertain. Then, at the critical moment, several Western Army units betrayed their allies and switched to Ieyasu's side. These betrayals had been carefully negotiated by Ieyasu beforehand, promises made and kept secret until the perfect moment. The Western Army collapsed. What had been a closely matched battle became a rout. Thousands were killed in the fighting, thousands more in the pursuit and in subsequent executions. Ishida Mitsunari was captured and beheaded. The daimyo who had supported the Western Army lost their lands, which Ieyasu distributed to his loyal followers. In a single afternoon, Tokugawa Ieyasu had become the most powerful man in Japan. Over the next 3 years he consolidated his control, forcing remaining daimyo to acknowledge his supremacy. In 1603 the emperor appointed him shogun. The Tokugawa shogunate had begun, and it would last until 1868, over 2.5 centuries of unbroken rule. But Ieyasu had one remaining threat: Hideyoshi's son Hideyori, now grown to manhood and still alive in Osaka Castle. As long as Hideyori lived, he represented an alternative to Tokugawa rule. Ieyasu bided his time, building his power, until 1614 when he manufactured a pretext for war. He besieged Osaka Castle with an army of 200,000 men. The siege involved the most advanced military technology of the age, including siege cannons that could destroy the castle's walls. Hideyori's forces fought desperately, but they were outnumbered and eventually overwhelmed. In 1615, as the castle fell, Hideyori and his mother committed suicide. The Toyotomi line was extinct. No rival remained who could challenge Tokugawa authority. Breathe deeply. Feel the exhaustion of these wars. Centuries of conflict, hundreds of thousands of deaths, the country torn apart and rebuilt and torn apart again. But now, finally, peace. Tokugawa Ieyasu had achieved what 3 generations of warriors had pursued: complete unification of Japan under a single government. What he built next would last longer than anyone could have imagined. Picture a country exhausted by war, desperate for stability. The early 1600s in Japan were a moment when strong government, any government that could maintain order, was welcome. Tokugawa Ieyasu and his successors used this opportunity to create a political system of remarkable sophistication and longevity. The foundation of Tokugawa rule was control of the daimyo. About 250 daimyo ruled domains throughout Japan, ranging from tiny territories producing just enough to support a few dozen samurai to vast provinces supporting tens of thousands of warriors. Ieyasu couldn't eliminate the daimyo system. It was too deeply embedded in Japanese society. Instead, he controlled it. Daimyo were classified into 3 categories. The feudal daimyo were families who had been Ieyasu's allies before Sekigahara, the most trusted. They received smaller domains but strategic positions near important roads, cities, and Edo itself. They filled the senior positions in the shogunate government. The Shinpan daimyo were members of the Tokugawa family, collateral branches who could potentially provide an heir if the main line failed. They received large, wealthy domains but were watched carefully. And then there were the Tozuma daimyo, the outside lords, families who had submitted to Ieyasu after Sekigahara. They were the least trusted, though some were among the most powerful. The Shimazu clan of Satsuma, the Mori clan of Choshu, the Date clan of Sendai, these controlled huge domains with substantial military forces. The shogunate placed them in remote locations, far from Edo, where they could be isolated if they rebelled. The genius of the Tokugawa system was the Sankin Kotai, or alternate attendance system, implemented in full by the 1630s. Every daimyo was required to maintain a residence in Edo and spend alternate years there, attending the shogun's court. When the daimyo returned to his home domain, his wife and heir had to remain in Edo as hostages. Picture what this meant. A daimyo from Kagoshima in southern Kyushu would travel for weeks to reach Edo, accompanied by an elaborate procession of hundreds of retainers, demonstrating his status and wealth. He would maintain a large mansion in Edo, staffed year-round. Half his life was spent in the capital, away from his domain, under the shogun's watch. His family was permanently held as surety for his good behavior. The system was brilliantly effective. It made rebellion almost impossible without abandoning your family. It forced daimyo to spend enormous sums maintaining their Edo residences and financing the expensive processions to and from the capital, preventing them from accumulating the wealth needed to wage war. It concentrated the families of Japan's military elite in one city, where they could watch each other and be watched by the shogunate. And it transformed Edo into the largest city on earth by the early 1700s, with perhaps 1 million inhabitants. The shogunate also implemented strict control over foreign contact. Christianity, which had been spreading in Japan, was seen as a destabilizing foreign ideology that placed loyalty to God above loyalty to one's lord. In the 1620s and 30s, the shogunate launched brutal persecutions. Christians were hunted down, tortured to force renunciation of their faith, and executed if they refused. Tens of thousands died. The persecutions climaxed with the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637, where Christian peasants and ronin held a castle against shogunate forces for months before being massacred, every man, woman, and child killed. Following this, the shogunate closed Japan to almost all foreign contact. Portuguese and Spanish traders and missionaries were expelled and forbidden to return under pain of death. Only the Dutch, who convinced the shogunate they had no interest in spreading Christianity, were allowed to maintain a tiny trading post on an artificial island in Nagasaki harbor. Chinese traders were also permitted under strict restrictions. Japanese were forbidden from traveling abroad, and foreign shipwrecked sailors found in Japanese waters were to be captured or killed. This wasn't complete isolation. Japan continued to receive information about the outside world through the Dutch trading post and through Chinese traders. But it was isolation enough to allow the Tokugawa system to develop without external interference for over 2 centuries. Now consider what happened to the samurai during this long peace. Remember, these were warriors. Their identity, their social status, their legal privileges all derived from their function as fighters. But after 1615 there were no more wars. No battles. No castles to besiege. What happens to a warrior class when there's nothing left to fight? The transformation was gradual but profound. Samurai became bureaucrats. Each daimyo maintained an administrative apparatus to govern his domain. Tax collectors, judges, police, record keepers, engineers. These positions were filled exclusively by samurai, who were paid stipends and rice from their lord's treasury. A samurai might spend his career managing irrigation systems, adjudicating disputes between villages, maintaining roads, or keeping financial records, never once drawing his sword in anger. The samurai retained their military training, at least nominally. They practiced swordsmanship in formal schools, learning kata, choreographed sequences of movements. Archery continued as a ceremonial art. The martial arts academies proliferated, teaching not just combat technique but also philosophy and ethical behavior. But this was training for contests and demonstrations, not war. Picture a mid-level samurai's life in 1700. He lives in his lord's castle town in a residence appropriate to his rank. His stipend, perhaps 100 koku of rice annually, is adequate but not generous. He maintains his swords, the most visible symbol of his status. He dresses in the formal styles prescribed for his rank. He reports to his assigned position in the domain administration each day, where he might review tax records, draft documents, or settle minor disputes. His sons will inherit his position and stipend, continuing the family's service. His daughters will marry other samurai, cementing alliances between families. He studies the Chinese classics because literacy and cultural refinement are expected of samurai. He practices tea ceremony and perhaps writes poetry. He attends his martial arts school several times a week, going through the motions of ancient techniques that he will never use in real combat. This life has structure, respect, and security. But it's far from the warrior existence his ancestors knew. And economically, it's increasingly precarious. Here's the problem that haunted the samurai throughout the Edo period. Their income was fixed in rice, but prices of everything else kept rising. A samurai might receive a stipend of 200 koku of rice per year, the same amount his grandfather had received. But the cost of maintaining appropriate clothing, housing, and lifestyle increased steadily. The economy was growing, becoming more sophisticated and commercialized, but the samurai were locked into a feudal payment system. Rice could be sold for money, but the exchange rate fluctuated, and handling such transactions was considered beneath a samurai's dignity. Many samurai fell into debt to merchants, a humiliating situation given that merchants ranked below samurai in the official social hierarchy. A proud warrior borrowing money from a commoner, unable to repay, legally prohibited from engaging in commerce to improve his finances, this was a recipe for resentment. Some domains tried to solve the problem through financial reforms, encouraging commerce, developing new industries, trying to increase the tax base. Some samurai took up craft work or teaching on the side, activities technically forbidden but increasingly overlooked. But the fundamental problem remained. The samurai class was supported by agricultural taxes in an economy that was increasingly urban and commercial. The merchants and artisans of the cities, especially Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto, were thriving. They developed a vibrant urban culture. Kabuki theater with its elaborate costumes and dramatic stories, ukiyo-e woodblock prints depicting everything from landscapes to courtesans to actors, pleasure districts where wealthy merchants could enjoy entertainments that would be scandalous in respectable society. Picture the Yoshiwara district in Edo, the licensed pleasure quarter. At night it came alive with lanterns and music. The finest courtesans were celebrities, trendsetters in fashion and culture, their images reproduced in prints that decorated middle-class homes. The most successful merchants lived better than many samurai, though they could never admit it publicly. Samurai weren't supposed to frequent such places, but many did, slipping in disguised, spending money they didn't have on pleasures that officially didn't exist. The contradictions in the system were becoming obvious to anyone paying attention. Yet despite or perhaps because of these contradictions, Edo period culture flourished in remarkable ways. The long peace allowed literacy to spread. By the late 1700s, Japan may have had higher literacy rates than most European countries. Publishing became a major industry. Books on every conceivable subject were widely available. Fiction developed new forms. Ihara Saikaka wrote witty, satirical stories about merchants and pleasure seekers, celebrating the vibrant commoner culture that officially didn't matter. Matsuo Basho perfected the haiku, elevating a simple 17-syllable form into high art capable of capturing moments of profound insight. Chikamatsu Manzaemon wrote plays for the Bunraku puppet theater that dealt with real social issues: the conflict between duty and desire, the tragedy of love across class boundaries, the human cost of rigid social structures. Scholarship thrived as well. Some samurai and commoners devoted themselves to Neo-Confucian philosophy, debating ethics and governance. Others pursued Dutch learning, studying Western science and medicine through the limited Dutch books that entered through Nagasaki. Japanese physicians learned Western anatomy, artists incorporated Western perspective into their work, and intellectuals engaged with European ideas about mathematics, astronomy, and geography. Consider Katsushika Hokusai, born in 1760, perhaps the most famous Japanese artist. He created over 30,000 works in his lifetime, constantly experimenting with new styles and subjects. His series 36 Views of Mount Fuji, particularly the iconic Great Wave off Kanagawa, demonstrates complete mastery of both traditional Japanese techniques and Western perspective. His work influenced European Impressionists decades later, showing that cultural exchange continued despite Japan's isolation. The world the Tokugawa shogunate had created was stable, cultured, and in many ways prosperous. But it was also rigid, economically stressed, and increasingly aware of its own contradictions. The samurai were warriors who didn't fight. The social hierarchy placed samurai above merchants, but merchants had the money. The philosophy emphasized loyalty and duty, but the reality involved hypocrisy and evasion. Change was coming, though few could see it in the peaceful years of the early 1800s. The first cracks appeared from outside. Western powers, particularly Britain and the United States, were expanding their commercial and military presence throughout Asia. They began pressing Japan to open its ports to trade. The shogunate's response was to reiterate the seclusion policy, turning away foreign ships, occasionally firing on them. But in 1853, an American naval squadron led by Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Edo Bay with steam-powered warships that the Japanese called black ships. Perry delivered a letter from the U.S. president demanding that Japan open trade relations. Then he left, promising to return the next year for an answer. Picture the shock in Edo. Ships larger than anything in the Japanese Navy, powered by steam engines Japanese had only read about in Dutch books, armed with cannons that could destroy coastal fortifications from beyond the range of any Japanese weapons. The technological gap was enormous and impossible to ignore. The shogunate was faced with an impossible choice: refuse and probably face military defeat, or agree and violate the sacred policy of seclusion that had defined the Tokugawa order for 2 centuries. When Perry returned in 1854, the shogunate agreed to limited trade. Ports were open to American and European vessels. Foreign diplomats arrived. The sealed world of the Tokugawa was cracking open. The shogunate's capitulation to foreign pressure discredited it in the eyes of many samurai, particularly in the powerful Tozama domains of southwestern Japan. Satsuma and Choshu, which had never fully accepted Tokugawa rule, saw an opportunity. A movement emerged calling for, expel the barbarians and revere the emperor, using the emperor as a symbol of Japanese tradition against both foreign intrusion and Tokugawa weakness. The 1850s and 60s saw increasing turmoil. Young samurai from Satsuma and Choshu began agitating for change. Some turned to assassination, killing shogunate officials and foreigners they saw as polluting Japan. The shogunate responded with repression, but this only created more resentment. Satsuma and Choshu began modernizing their military forces with Western weapons, preparing for conflict. The shogunate tried to reform, to modernize its own military, to respond to both foreign pressure and domestic discontent. But the contradictions in the system had become too great. The long peace had made the shogunate's military power irrelevant. The fixed incomes had impoverished many samurai. The rigid social system was increasingly unsuited to Japan's changing economy. The foreign threat exposed all these weaknesses at once. In 1867, the shogun resigned, returning political authority to the emperor in what was supposed to be a peaceful transition. But Satsuma and Choshu forces, backed by the emperor's court, were not satisfied with half measures. They demanded the complete abolition of the shogunate. Civil war erupted. The Boshin War lasted less than 2 years, from 1868 to 1869. It pitted the imperial forces, equipped with modern rifles and advised by European military experts, against the shogunate's forces, which included some very traditional samurai who still believed in the old ways. The outcome was never really in doubt. The imperial forces won decisively. The last shogun retired into obscurity. A new government, ruling in the name of Emperor Meiji, took power. They called it the Meiji Restoration, but it was really a revolution. And for the samurai, it was the beginning of the end. Settle deeper into rest as we approach the end of the samurai's story. The new Meiji government, despite being supported by samurai from Satsuma and Choshu, quickly decided that the samurai class itself was obsolete. Japan needed to modernize rapidly to avoid colonization by Western powers. The feudal system, with its fixed agricultural taxes supporting a hereditary warrior class, was incompatible with modern industrial economy and military organization. The reforms came quickly, one after another, each one dismantling another piece of the samurai's world. In 1869, the daimyo were ordered to return their domains to the emperor. These domains, which had been private fiefs for centuries, became prefectures administered by appointed governors. The daimyo were compensated with government bonds and pensions, but their independent power was gone. Picture the shock. Families that had ruled their territories for hundreds of years, suddenly reduced to pensioners. In 1871, the domains were officially abolished and replaced with a centralized prefectural system. The entire feudal structure of Japan, which had existed for 700 years, was swept away in a few legislative acts. For ordinary samurai, the situation was even worse. In 1873, the Meiji government established a conscript army. Every able-bodied male, regardless of class, could be drafted for military service. This ended the samurai's monopoly on military service, the fundamental basis of their privileged status. Peasants, merchants, anyone could be a soldier now. The samurai's unique function had been eliminated. The government began commuting samurai stipends into one-time bond payments. Samurai received bonds worth roughly 5 to 10 years of their former annual stipend. After that, they were on their own. For samurai who had never engaged in commercial activity, who had no skills except administration and outdated military training, this was devastating. Thousands were plunged into poverty. The final symbolic blow came in 1876. An edict prohibited the wearing of swords in public, except by military and police personnel. For samurai, the sword was the sole, the visible mark of their status. To walk in public without a sword was to acknowledge that you were no longer samurai. Many wept when they put away their swords for the last time. Picture an aging samurai in 1876, a man whose father and grandfather had been samurai, who had been raised to honor the old traditions. His domain is gone. His stipend is gone. He is prohibited from wearing his sword. His sons are being educated in Western-style schools, learning English and science instead of Confucian classics and swordsmanship. Everything he believed in, everything that gave his life meaning, has been declared obsolete. For some samurai, the transition was manageable. Those with education and administrative skills found positions in the new government, in business, in education. The Meiji government was built largely by former samurai, men who adapted quickly to the new order. Samurai values of discipline, loyalty, and duty translated well to modern institutional contexts. Many samurai became successful in the new Japan. But many others could not adapt. They were too old, too invested in the old ways, too proud to accept what they saw as humiliation. And they were angry. Angry at the government that had betrayed them. Angry at the Western powers that had forced this change. Angry at a world that no longer valued what they had spent their lives mastering. Throughout the early 1870s, small samurai rebellions broke out in various parts of Japan. These were quickly suppressed by the new conscript army, proving that the old samurai military superiority was gone. But the discontent continued to simmer, particularly in Satsuma, where many samurai felt doubly betrayed. They had helped overthrow the shogunate, expecting to be rewarded, and instead found themselves abolished. Seigo Takamori was the most respected samurai in Satsuma, a hero of the Boshin War, one of the architects of the Meiji Restoration. He was a large, imposing man, known for his integrity and traditional values. He had served in the Meiji government briefly but resigned in 1873 over a policy dispute. He returned to Satsuma, where he established private academies for young samurai, teaching traditional martial skills and values. The Meiji government viewed these academies with suspicion. They seemed like preparation for rebellion. Tensions escalated throughout 1876. Then, in early 1877, the government moved to confiscate weapons from private samurai academies. The samurai of Satsuma, led reluctantly by Seigo, rose in open rebellion. Picture the last war of the samurai. In February 1877, Seigo led roughly 30,000 samurai and students from Satsuma north toward Tokyo. They were motivated by a mixture of grievances: the loss of samurai privileges, anger at rapid westernization, resentment at being discarded by the government they had helped create, and perhaps a desire to die honorably rather than fade away. The Meiji government responded by mobilizing 60,000 troops, mostly conscripts, peasant boys in Western-style uniforms carrying modern rifles. The technological and tactical advantages lay entirely with the government forces. But the rebel samurai fought with desperate courage, knowing they were probably doomed. The campaign lasted for 7 months. The rebels won early victories, besieging Kumamoto Castle, where a government garrison held out through weeks of attacks. The rebels fought with traditional weapons and tactics, charging machine gun positions with swords, trying to get close enough for hand-to-hand combat where their martial skills might matter. It was heartbreaking and feudal. Modern rifles and artillery killed them from distances where swords were useless. For every government soldier they killed, they lost 10 of their own. The government forces pressed relentlessly, pushing the rebels south, back towards Satsuma. Breathe deeply and feel the tragedy unfolding. These were not bad men. They were warriors trying to maintain their honor in a world that had moved past them. They fought knowing they would lose, that their cause was doomed, that nothing would change even if they somehow won. But they fought anyway because that's what samurai did. They fought because surrender would be shameful, because their code demanded courage in the face of death, because dying in battle was better than slow dissolution into irrelevance. By September, Seigo and a few hundred surviving rebels were trapped on Shirayama, a hill outside Kagoshima. Government forces, now numbering over 60,000, surrounded them completely. Artillery pounded the hilltop. Machine guns covered every approach. On the night of September 23, 1877, Seigo decided to break the siege. At dawn on September 24, he led his remaining men in a final charge down the hill. They were met with overwhelming firepower. Within hours, almost all were killed. Seigo himself was badly wounded early in the fighting. Rather than be captured, he performed seppuku, the ritual suicide that samurai had honored for centuries. His friend beheaded him to complete the ritual. With Seigo's death, the Satsuma rebellion ended. The samurai class had fought its last battle and lost. Not just the battle but the war, the culture war against modernity. The samurai as a political and military class were finished, gone, swept into history. Let your breath slow as we contemplate what was lost and what remained. The samurai, as a class with legal privileges and political power, were extinct. The Meiji government had crushed the last resistance and proceeded with modernization. Japan would become an industrial and military power, would defeat Russia in war in 1904, would build an empire, would eventually challenge the Western powers they had once feared. But it would do all this as a modern nation-state, not a feudal warrior society. What happened to the former samurai? Some thrived. They became government ministers, business leaders, military officers, educators. The Meiji elite was largely composed of former samurai, men who adapted their traditional values to modern contexts. Companies like Mitsubishi and Mitsui were founded or developed by former samurai families. The modern Japanese military, though conscript-based, was officered by men from samurai backgrounds who brought their traditions of discipline and honor to the new institution. Others struggled. Thousands of former samurai descended into poverty, unable to adapt to commercial society, their skills obsolete, their pride preventing them from accepting menial work. Some became rickshaw pullers, a cruel irony, warriors pulling peasants in carts. Some turned to crime. Some simply faded away, dying in obscurity. The sword-making tradition nearly died out. With no one allowed to carry swords and the samurai class abolished, there seemed to be no purpose for master swordsmiths. Many destroyed their tools and records rather than continue a craft that had lost its meaning. The martial arts schools survived by transforming themselves, emphasizing spiritual development and physical culture rather than combat training. Kendo became a sport. Judo was systematized as a form of physical and moral education. Aikido was developed in the early 20th century as an explicitly non-violent martial art. But something unexpected happened. As the generation that had known real samurai died off, the next generation became nostalgic for what was lost. The samurai began to be romanticized, transformed from real people with flaws and virtues into symbols of ideal Japanese character. Writers, artists, and eventually filmmakers created an idealized version of samurai history, emphasizing honor, loyalty, and martial skill while downplaying the brutality, the mundane reality of bureaucratic life, and the frequent betrayals that characterized actual samurai history. And so the samurai lived on, not as a class but as a myth, a symbol, a set of values that could be invoked for various purposes. And that brings us to the final section of our journey, the invention of bushidō and the samurai's life as cultural symbol. Let your mind drift through the early 20th century, a time when Japan was rapidly changing, industrializing, building an empire, and looking for a cultural identity that could bridge the gap between traditional Japan and the modern nation-state. The samurai, so recently abolished, began to be reinvented as symbols of timeless Japanese values. The key figure in this reinvention was Naito Benatsu, a Japanese scholar and Christian who published a book in 1899 called Bushidō, The Soul of Japan, written in English and aimed at Western audiences. Naito presented Bushido, the way of the warrior, as an ancient code of ethics that had shaped Japanese character for centuries. He described 7 principles: righteousness, courage, benevolence, respect, honesty, honor, and loyalty. This sounded ancient and traditional. It wasn't. Or rather, it was a creative reconstruction that took elements from various periods of Japanese history, mixed them with Confucian philosophy, added Christian ethics that Naito had learned during his years studying in the West, and presented the whole package as an unchanging Japanese tradition. The real samurai of the Sengoku period would have found much of Naito's Bushido bizarre. They had been practical men concerned with survival, advantage, land, and the complex web of personal loyalties. They betrayed and were betrayed regularly. They were as motivated by greed and ambition as by any ethical code. The Edo period samurai had been bureaucrats, many of them never even holding a real sword in combat. But Naito's Bushido served a purpose. It gave Japan a cultural identity that could be presented to the world, something that seemed equivalent to European chivalry or American frontier values. It provided a framework for understanding Japanese behavior that Westerners could grasp, and it gave the Japanese themselves a usable past, a tradition they could claim and be proud of, even if it was largely invented. The Japanese government and military enthusiastically adopted this new Bushido ideology. It was taught in schools. It was used to inspire soldiers. The imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, issued in 1882, emphasized loyalty, courage, and honor in language that drew on samurai traditions, real and invented. Young Japanese men were taught that they inherited the spirit of the samurai, that they should be willing to die for the emperor and the nation just as samurai had died for their lords. Picture a Japanese schoolboy in the 1920s, learning about the great samurai heroes of the past. The 47 ronin who avenged their master and then committed mass suicide, Kusunoki Masashige who fought loyally for the emperor even when the cause was hopeless, Seigo Takamori charging to his death rather than surrender. These stories, simplified and sanitized, became part of Japan's national mythology. As Japan became increasingly militaristic in the 1930s, the Bushido mythology took on darker tones. Military officers, many from former samurai families, promoted an extreme version of Bushido that emphasized death over surrender, obedience over independent judgment, and national glory over human life. During World War II, this ideology led to horrific consequences. Japanese soldiers were taught that surrender was shameful, that death in battle was glorious. This led to suicidal banzai charges against overwhelming firepower, to soldiers hiding in caves and fighting to the death rather than surrender, to the kamikaze suicide pilots who deliberately crashed their planes into enemy ships. The kamikaze, named after the divine wind that saved Japan from the Mongols, were presented as the ultimate expression of samurai spirit, willing self-sacrifice for the nation. The reality was more complex and darker than the propaganda suggested. Many kamikaze pilots were young men with little choice, ordered to die for a cause that was already lost. Many Japanese soldiers surrendered when given the opportunity despite the ideology. The Bushido promoted by the wartime government was a militaristic distortion used to extract obedience and sacrifice from the population. Japan's defeat in 1945 discredited this militaristic Bushido. The occupation forces under General MacArthur banned the teaching of traditional values in schools, seeing them as contributing to Japanese aggression. Bushido seemed to be finished, another casualty of Japan's catastrophic war. but cultural myths are resilient. As Japan recovered economically in the 1950s and 60s, Bushido was rehabilitated and reinterpreted once again. Now it was stripped of its militaristic elements and presented as business ethics. Loyalty to one's company, dedication to work, honor in business dealings, perseverance in the face of difficulty. The samurai became a model not for soldiers but for salarymen. Now drift forward to the post-war era and the globalization of samurai imagery. Japanese cinema discovered the samurai film as a genre, and these films began to reach international audiences. Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, released in 1954, was a masterpiece that influenced world cinema profoundly. It presented samurai as complex characters with individual motivations, living in a morally ambiguous world. The film was remade as the American Western, The Magnificent Seven, showing how samurai stories could translate across cultures. Kurosawa made several more samurai films, each exploring different aspects of the samurai myth. Throne of Blood adapted Shakespeare's Macbeth to samurai-era Japan, showing the corruption of honor by ambition. Yojimbo presented a cynical ronin playing two sides against each other, motivated more by personal interest than loyalty. These were not the idealized samurai of government propaganda, but flawed human characters trying to survive in a harsh world. Other directors created different types of samurai films. Some were pure action, showcasing the choreographed violence of sword combat. Others were more philosophical, exploring themes of duty, loyalty, and moral choice. The samurai became a flexible symbol that could carry many meanings. And then the samurai entered global popular culture in entirely new forms. Manga and anime discovered the samurai as a rich source of stories. Some stayed relatively historical, like Lone Wolf and Cub, a manga about a masterless samurai and his young son wandering Edo period Japan. Others mixed samurai imagery with fantasy elements, creating warriors with supernatural powers fighting in alternate versions of Japanese history. Rurouni Kenshin presented a samurai trying to atone for his violent past by refusing to kill, a fascinating inversion of the traditional warrior ethic. Samurai Champloo blended samurai stories with hip-hop aesthetics, creating something entirely new that used samurai iconography in unexpected ways. Video games like Ghost of Tsushima allowed players to inhabit a samurai's role, making moral choices about honor and pragmatism in the context of the Mongol invasions. The samurai had become a global cultural property, recognized and used worldwide. Hollywood made samurai films starring Western actors, sometimes respectfully, sometimes with little understanding of the actual history. Martial arts schools teaching kendo, aikido, and jiu-jitsu spread throughout the world, often mixing historical techniques with invented traditions and spiritual teachings that would have confused actual samurai. And here, as you drift even deeper towards sleep, we must return to the core message, the truth that lies beneath all the mythology. The samurai of legend, the fearless warriors living by an ancient code of honor, constantly engaged in dramatic sword duels, choosing death over dishonor, these samurai mostly did not exist. They are a creation of later ages, a useful myth that has served various purposes but bears little resemblance to historical reality. The real samurai for most of their history were bureaucrats living off agricultural taxes. During the 250 years of the Edo period, which is when most samurai iconography was developed, the vast majority of samurai never fought in a single battle. They were civil servants managing the affairs of their lord's domain, attending to paperwork, settling disputes, maintaining infrastructure, and worrying about their declining economic status. Even during the warfare of the Sengoku period, the romantic image of individual samurai engaging in honorable single combat was more myth than reality. Battles were chaotic affairs dominated by mass infantry formations, firearms, and strategic maneuvering. Individual heroism existed, but it was the exception, not the norm. Betrayal was common. Loyalty was contingent on circumstances. The code of Bushido, supposedly governing samurai behavior for centuries, was largely invented in the Meiji period, decades after the samurai class was abolished. Real samurai followed various ethical codes that varied by time period and circumstances. They were as capable of selfishness, cruelty, and self-interest as any other humans. The idealized version of Bushido was created retrospectively to serve nationalist purposes and later commercialized for global consumption. But does this make the samurai story less interesting? Not at all. In fact, the truth is more fascinating than the legend. The samurai were humans navigating complex political and social systems, trying to maintain their status and honor in changing circumstances, adapting and evolving over centuries. They created sophisticated cultural traditions while also being practical and often ruthless. They were warriors who became administrators who maintained warrior identities even when those identities became obsolete. Their eventual abolition was probably inevitable, a necessary step in Japan's modernization. But their symbolic life as representations of honor, discipline, and martial skill continues because those values remain relevant. We may not need warriors anymore, but we still value courage, dedication, and mastery of craft. The samurai myth, even as myth, serves useful purposes. In contemporary Japan, the samurai legacy is everywhere and nowhere. Samurai films and anime are popular entertainment. Martial arts descended from samurai traditions are practiced as sports and spiritual disciplines. Business culture still sometimes uses samurai metaphors, though less than in previous generations. Historical sites like castles and samurai residences are popular tourist destinations. But the actual social influence of samurai culture has largely faded. Modern Japan is a democracy with a pacifist constitution. The values of personal fulfillment, economic success, and individual choice have replaced the feudal values of loyalty to one's lord and social hierarchy. Young Japanese people are more likely to dream of careers in technology or entertainment than to idealize samurai traditions. The martial arts that descended from samurai training have become globalized sports and practices. Kendo practitioners in Brazil or Kenya are learning techniques developed centuries ago in Japan, but adapted to modern contexts. The spiritual elements of these practices, the emphasis on discipline and self-improvement, have been separated from their original feudal context. Samurai imagery has become a kind of aesthetic, a visual shortcut to certain ideas about honor, skill, and exotic beauty. Video games, movies, fashion designers, and artists around the world use samurai motifs because they carry certain associations and look interesting, often with minimal connection to actual history. And perhaps that's fine. The samurai as actual political and military class are gone, but the samurai as symbols and stories continue to evolve. Each generation reinterprets the samurai for its own purposes. The militaristic bushidō of the 1930s served nationalism and war. The business bushidō of the 1960s served economic development. The samurai of contemporary global pop culture serve entertainment and artistic inspiration. The real story, the history of how a class of warriors emerged, evolved, became bureaucrats, and were eventually abolished, is available to anyone interested enough to look past the myths. That story, complex and human and surprising, is what I've tried to share with you tonight. The night has grown deep around us. You've traveled through nearly 1,000 years of history, from the elegant courts of Heian to the rebellions of Meiji, from the chaos of the Sengoku period to the long peace of the Tokugawa, from the real lives of warriors and bureaucrats to the mythology that grew up around them after they were gone. The samurai are gone, but their stories remain. Those stories have been polished and changed and adapted to serve different purposes in different eras, but beneath the mythology lies a fascinating historical reality. Warriors who became bureaucrats, men navigating complex loyalties in changing times, a culture that produced both sophisticated arts and brutal violence, a class that dominated Japan for centuries and then disappeared in a single generation. If you're still awake, I hope you found this journey interesting. If you've drifted off to sleep, I hope your dreams have been filled with the images we've explored: ancient palaces and burning castles, warriors on horseback and peasants in rice fields, the clash of swords and the quiet of tea ceremonies, the storm winds that saved Japan and the storms of change that transformed it. The history of the samurai is ultimately a human story. These were people with hopes and fears, ambitions and limitations, living in specific historical circumstances and trying to make their way as best they could. Some were heroes, some were villains, most were somewhere in between. Their legacy, both the real history and the invented mythology, continues to shape how we think about honor, duty, martial skill, and Japanese culture. If you've enjoyed this journey through samurai history, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel for more explorations of history's fascinating stories. There are so many more tales to tell from so many times and places. History is full of surprises, of complexity, of humans making choices in difficult circumstances, of myths and realities intertwining in unexpected ways. But for now, rest. Let your mind settle. The story is told. The samurai have lived their lives, fought their battles, adapted to change, and passed into history and legend. And you, dear listener, have accompanied them on that journey. Sleep well and may your dreams be peaceful. Good night.